And this is the Q&A podcast, and I'm your host, Peter Slen. Thanks for joining us. Mollie Hemingway, in her new book, describes Samuel Alito as the justice who reshaped the Supreme Court and restored the Constitution. Why does she say that? Well, we'll find out shortly. Samuel Alito has been on the Supreme Court since 2006. Appointed by George W. Bush, he has been a quiet force most well known for his writing the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade. In her new book entitled Alito, the Justice Who Reshaped the Court and Restored the Constitution, Mollie Hemingway, who is the editor of the Federalist, discusses the life, career, and legal opinions of Justice Alito. She also talks about his role in overturning Roe v. Wade, the flag controversy involving his wife Martha Ann, and the backlash that he and other justices on the court have received in response to their legal decisions. And our conversation with Mollie Hemingway begins now. Mollie Hemingway is the author of this book, Alito, the Justice Who Reshaped the Supreme Court and Restored the Constitution. First off, Mollie Hemingway, are you a fan of Samuel Alito?
Well, it's difficult not to admire someone like Justice Alito, but originally when I became interested in writing about him, it was because many people who I did admire, or people who I found to be impressive in some way or another, kept talking about him as this justice who nobody talks about, even though they thought he was a giant on the court. And some of these people were his colleagues, and they wondered, why does nobody pay attention to him? And that just kind of sat with me for a while, and it became bigger, and I realized, well, I would like to know more about him. And frequently, if I'm writing, it's because I want to know more about something. And so that's how I came to write it.
Did he participate in this book in any way?
Well, I spoke with nearly 100 people, including many Supreme Court justices. But when I speak to the justices, I usually don't say which ones I spoke to.
Subtitle: Someone who reshaped the court. What do you mean by that?
Well, for many decades, we had a court that had these other influences, an idea that the court was to exist, as some previous justices had said, to say what modern man felt or thought. And over the years, we saw this movement, a conservative legal movement, to have the court be one that cared about the original meaning of the Constitution, and to have fairly certain ideas about how to interpret statutes. Only a quarter of the cases before the Supreme Court deal with the Constitution. 3/4 are statutory. And so this was a very different approach from what we'd seen in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And as that shift got going in the 80s, we now have a majority of justices who do say that they adhere to the original meaning of the Constitution when interpreting decisions. And Alito has been this person who's less theoretical than a Justice Scalia or a Justice Thomas. These are two men who are very clear on their philosophy, or were, and they would say, well, this is what the law should be. This is how it should be properly interpreted. And they would sort of just say it and leave it at that. Alito is more the person who says, well, I agree that we should be over there, but we should think about how to get there. And so he moves the court steadily, incrementally, into a more originalist direction. But because it's less flashy than some of his peers, I think people haven't noticed how significant he has been that way.
When you were starting out on this book, or before you started out on this book, you said that you talked to people and Samuel Alito's name kept coming up. What were people saying about him?
So there are, in Washington, D.C., most attorneys who you speak with will say that most attorneys on the right who you speak with would say that they love Justice Scalia. They hang on every word of his dissents or of his opinions. Obviously, Justice Thomas is a legendary American figure. Many Americans know and love him. They've read his own book about his life. They've read other books about him. But there's a certain type of conservative lawyer who I've encountered. They care deeply about really deep issues determining what America is, and they tend to be less Like, they don't think just because a particular Supreme Court decision went a good way that that means that the country is okay. These people seem to resonate more with a Justice Alito, and they also admire the strength of his writing. He's definitely a writer for judges. Before he served on the Supreme Court, he was a federal judge for 15 years. Prior to that, he was a U.S. attorney. He was a civil servant in the Department of Justice before becoming a political employee in the Department of Justice. He thinks about how Supreme Court decisions will be implemented by lower courts and then also people involved in rule of law generally. And so he has a different approach than, again, that more theoretical or philosophical approach that some of his peers are known for and beloved for.
So after 20 years on the court, is that his main legacy?
Well, I would say probably his main legacy would be achieving what the conservative legal movement had attempted to do for almost 50 years, which was to overturn Roe v. Wade. You know, Supreme Court justices have lengthy tenures. Frequently, they're involved in a lot of important cases. They're kind of lucky to be known for one thing, and that will probably be the one thing that Justice Alito is known for. Almost immediately when Roe v. Wade was handed down, it had a lot of criticism, not just from pro-lifers who didn't like that the decision had said that there was a hidden right to abortion in the 14th Amendment, but just constitutional scholars who said, whatever this is, it's not really constitutional law. Reads more like a policy document or a piece of legislation. And so it had been this very unifying thing of pro-lifers, sure, but also just conservative lawyers and even other lawyers in general. People like Ruth Bader Ginsburg was not a fan of Roe v. Wade. You know, it was not a decision that was loved, and it was widely derided. And there had been many efforts to reshape the court so that a court would overturn it. Those previous efforts had fallen, usually dealing with major public pressure. Like in 1992, there was a case that a lot of people thought might be the case that overturned
the Casey
Roe.
Case?
Casey v. Planned Parenthood out of Pennsylvania. But there were 3 Republican appointed justices who carved out a troika, as they called themselves, to rewrite Roe in a manner that they thought was more defensible. They still said the abortion right was hidden, but it was hidden in a different section of the 14th Amendment. They told everybody to stop fighting about it. Obviously, people did not stop fighting about it. So it became this thing that people really needed to deal with. And a big part of Alito, that in the book Alito that I write about, is how that Roe decision came to be overturned through the Dobbs case out of Mississippi, and what a large role Justice Alito played in that, including authoring this decision that kept 5 people together under the worst pressure we've seen on the court in its history.
Justice Ginsburg, one of her critiques wasn't it, that, well, state laws on abortion are moving in this direction. Now we've just kind of nullified that entire process.
Yes, which matches quite a bit with what Alito ended up doing in his Dobbs decision. Didn't say abortion is legal or abortion is illegal, but that it should be left to the people and their legislatures.
Will he retire this year?
I don't believe he will retire this year. Technically, I have no idea, but it just doesn't seem like he's ready to do that at this point. He is the second oldest justice on the court. There are 3 Republican appointed justices in their 70s. Clarence Thomas has indicated he's going out feet first, as he likes to joke. But Justice Alito, I think he still has a few things he would like to do. He's worked very hard on certain areas of jurisprudence, and religious liberty being another big one. And I think he maybe sees some opportunities in the years ahead to make that work better for him.
Well, here's the current court. We'll start with Chief Justice John Roberts, appointed by George W. Bush in 2005. Clarence Thomas was George H.W. Bush in 1991. Samuel Alito, W. Bush in 2006. Sonia Sotomayor was an appointee of President Obama in 2009. Elena Kagan was also Obama, 2010. Neil Gorsuch, Trump in 2017. Brett Kavanaugh, Trump in 2018. Amy Coney Barrett, Trump in 2020. And Ketanji Brown Jackson, Biden in 2022. Mollie Hemingway, we often see 6-3 decisions or 5-4 decisions. We don't talk much about the unanimous decisions or the mixed up decisions. We all think we can predict how the court is going to vote on an issue?
So, first off, there are quite a few unanimous or nearly unanimous decisions. People don't pay attention to those for obvious reasons. They're less newsworthy, but I think that it should be noted what a high percentage of the cases are decided in a nearly unanimous or unanimous fashion. There are also justices with very strong views. Some of them are very consistent. You have a Justice Thomas and a Justice Alito who tend to be on the same side of an issue. It's not surprising. They've written volumes on their jurisprudence, and you kind of can see where they're going to land, although they can still surprise you. There was a case in April where Justice Thomas wrote the majority opinion with the three more liberal justices, and I can't remember who the fifth person was, and Justice Alito wrote the dissenting words on that. So you can't totally predict it, but you do know enough about people's jurisprudence for the most part to have some idea. There are cases like birthplace citizenship, which have never really come before the court. It's a total, people think they know, they think it's going to go one way, but I would not be surprised if we're all surprised by how that goes.
In your book, Alito, you write that the Roberts Court has become the best court in decades, not by breaking with fundamental principles of conservatism, but by instantiating them in the life of an institution. The court is providing a case study in working for the Constitution and not against it.
Well, you hear so much criticism of the Roberts Court, and you frankly hear it from both left and right. The left has been frustrated that an institution that they used to dominate is no longer under more liberal control. That's understandable. The right is frustrated that not every justice is like a Thomas or an Alito, and they feel that Chief Justice Roberts or one of the newer Trump appointees are not living up to what they were told. It's all legitimate to have this kind of discussion about it, but people should remember too, this is a highly capable court. Their credentials are really impressive. They all work very hard. They explain their reasoning really well, even if you disagree with it. And they have done a good job of interpreting the Constitution according to its original meaning and attempting to have very defensible cases for what they do. So any criticism that can and should happen should, I think, also be in that realm where people understand that this is a highly capable court.
Well, there have been some speeches and remarks by a couple of justices recently, Sotomayor, Brown Jackson, and Clarence Thomas, that perhaps there's a little tension on the court and the comedy is not quite as high as it used to be.
Right. So since the court began, there has always been an effort to have people on the court get along well. And it is a bit of a challenge. These are people who are brilliant. They have very strongly held views about how the law should be interpreted. They disagree with each other frequently, and it's a very small workplace. And I don't even just mean by that there are really only 9 of them, but even their staff, that's a very small number of people that are staffing their chambers or the court itself. So you have to put a lot of effort into it. You have seen in times past that the justices actually all lived in the same house while they had their short Supreme Court session. You had habits or practices such as making sure that everybody shakes each other's hands before they go out for oral argument or when they are meeting in conference. And there are certain norms associated with it. So one of the norms would be that you are, of course, free and welcome to criticize each other, but that you do that in your written opinions and dissents. And you really have them go after each other in this form. It's almost funny to see. And one of the things I thought was funny was when Justice Scalia said that Justice Thomas had crafted a liberty-destroying cocktail or something like that. And so the next time they went out for drinks, Clarence Thomas ordered a liberty-destroying cocktail, of course. But they don't speak ill of each other traditionally. They don't speak ill of each other publicly, and they don't undermine the integrity of the court publicly. So they might even write, I fear that this decision will undermine the integrity of the court, but they don't, when they're out speaking publicly, they're really encouraged by the culture to speak well of each other. And we have seen that breakdown. We had Justice Sotomayor do what many of her colleagues thought was an unfair swipe against Justice Kavanaugh. and she did apologize for that. And I think that was good that she apologized for that. But you've also seen Justice Kagan and Sotomayor and Jackson, I think, and maybe others, speaking about the integrity of the court being in question. Now, the conservative justices were not in control of the court for a very long time without uttering those kinds of comments publicly.
Mollie Hemingway, this is your third book. Who else have you written about?
Well, the first book I co-authored with Carrie Severino. That was Justice on Trial, which was the story of the Kavanaugh confirmation and the future of the Supreme Court. I've loved working on that with Carrie, and I loved interviewing a lot of people for that. And that's really what I'd always been interested in, the Supreme Court, but having a best-selling book about the Supreme Court and all the work that went into that taught me that I really enjoyed these types of interviews with judges, justices, law professors. And then my second book was on the 2020 election and was about how the election had been handled and changed, and also about just election law in general.
Did you find that there was illegalities in the 2020 election?
I had wanted to look into this book because there were so many wild things being said after the 2020 election. You had people on the left saying this was the most pure election we've ever seen in history. You had people on the right saying that they thought Venezuela had controlled the voting machines, and it seemed like different than any election I had participated in, and also that I was skeptical of some of the more outlandish claims about what was being made. So I just wanted to look into it. And what I learned was that there's a lot to be said for election administration. Democrats have invested heavily in how to administer an election, and they have gotten some benefits from that. But even so, the 2020 election was different in so many ways. For instance, Mark Zuckerberg gave hundreds of millions of dollars to two liberal nonprofit groups that were then embedded into the government election offices in the blue areas of swing states. And that enabled them to get out the vote efforts in a way that predominantly helped Democrats. Now, that was never litigated, whether that's legal or not, but I think it's certainly an open question. Or also sometimes because of the emergency of COVID, you had people changing election administration in ways that previously wouldn't have been allowed. So usually it has to go through the state legislature, constitutionally speaking, but you might have a secretary of state or a governor just unilaterally making these changes. But more than anything, I just wanted to look at how elections are administered, what people should know about that, how they can get involved in having elections administered in a way that everybody can trust that an election result is the correct result.
From start to publication in April of 2026, how long were you working on the Alito book?
I don't remember exactly when I started. I remember when I wanted to start it was 2019. I don't remember when I actually started, but it was, I would say, 3 or 4 years. And it was fun to write, but a lengthy project. And my previous 2 books I'd done in fairly short order. So this was a bit more drawn out. When I told my children that I was going to write this book, one of them actually cried because, when you write a book, it takes time away from your family, and I hope that child understands why I did it. And
do you write at home?
Yes.
And lock yourself away?
I ask everybody to be quiet. Sometimes that means I have to wait till everybody goes to sleep, and then I write into the wee hours.
You are also editor-in-chief of the Federalist, which is?
The Federalist is an online daily publication that covers politics, policy, and culture. And we started that in, I think, 2013, and it's been just a wonderful joy. And I love my colleagues there as well. We look at all the major issues, and also we critique how most media cover those issues. Just this year, we won a large journalism prize for our work uncovering the Russia collusion hoax. So where most media were actually perpetuating the Russia collusion hoax, we were investigating and discovered what most people now know, which is that the claim that the 2016 election was stolen by colluding with Russia was not actually true.
Is it associated with the Federalist Society?
No, except for a shared love of the Federalist Papers and the founding. There's no relationship between Federalist Society and the Federalist. Now, I did certainly cover the Federalist in this book and with my co-author, Carrie Severino, in the first book on the Supreme Court, just because the Federalist Society is such a big player in the conservative legal movement, and certainly interviewed a lot of people. And Justice Alito himself, was a longtime member of the Federalist Society and still speaks at their events.
Is it fair to say that Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society is a kind of enigmatic figure in Washington?
Well, he's been a long-playing political figure. It's interesting, even on the Alito stuff, he was involved in helping the White House with the original nominee for that position, who was Harriet Miers, and many people were frustrated by that, but I think he himself was also very pleased when Alito was the nominee.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. But you report in your book that Harriet Miers, who was the legal counsel to George W. Bush, was pushing for Alito to be the nominee.
I found that very interesting. I actually loved going back. I remembered that summer when John Roberts got the first nomination, Harriet Miers gets the second nomination. The conservative movement reacted with just extreme frustration. They cared deeply about the Supreme Court. But when I was interviewing people, I will say my view of Harriet Miers was changed somewhat. Her closest colleagues and friends praised her intellect and her reasoning and thought that she was unfairly treated. And then, yes, she herself had actually wanted Alito from the very beginning. She thought he had a consistency and coherency that some of the other candidates lacked.
John Roberts was nominated to replace, I forget who, at first, but then got nominated for Chief Justice when William Rehnquist died.
Right. So the Bush White House had been expecting to have an opening their entire first term. They really thought it would be Rehnquist. He was getting up there. He'd always told his clerks that he thought that justices stay too long at their jobs. He was suffering, he had physical ailments. He makes it through the first term. I think the Bush administration was frustrated by that he hadn't stepped down prior to that. He swears President Bush in for his second inauguration, and he did not seem well physically. They were sure he was going to retire. So they basically just make plans like he's going to retire. And they had a short list of people, interesting short list. But then it was Sandra Day O'Connor who retired. And that surprised everybody, but they were like, oh, let's just keep going as if it had been Rehnquist. They picked John Roberts. He was definitely the DC favorite. And he had so many ties to Republicans that I think a lot of people thought he would be more conservative than he ever claimed he was. People get frustrated with him, but if you go back and watch his hearings, he doesn't say he actually says that he doesn't have a judicial philosophy. So when people get frustrated, they should remember he didn't claim to be an originalist or
really no paper trail.
Right. And it was funny to see who picked up on that and who did not. But Roberts is preparing for his confirmation hearings, and I think it was 2 or 3 days before they were to begin, Rehnquist dies. And so the Bush team decided to pull his nomination for the Sandra Day O'Connor seat and instead have it be for the Chief Justice. They had already inquired on the court enough to know that the people they probably would have liked to be Chief Justice wouldn't do it, and then some actually had no interest in it. It's not a great position. It's a lot of administrative work, and you have the same exact vote as anyone else. So if you are not in love with administration, I can see why some justices would prefer to be a justice, associate
the
justice.
Chief Justice oversees the entire federal court system, doesn't he?
Yeah, and he does have a larger staff in order to do that, but it still seems a bit of a headache to have to deal with.
So, Roberts has moved into the Chief Justice nomination slot. So there is another opening, though.
Yes, and Sandra Day O'Connor, who had been chosen by President Reagan because he promised to appoint a woman to the Supreme Court, and there weren't really a great number of women who matched what he wanted who would fill that position. So she'd been pulled from like the Arizona Supreme Court or some lower level court. She wanted a woman to replace her. Laura Bush strongly wanted a woman to replace Sandra Day O'Connor. She was on a global trip. They say politicians shouldn't talk about things when they're abroad. She was on a global trip to Africa or something, and She expressed that she really hoped that her husband would appoint a woman, and President Bush dryly responds when told about this, "Well, I look forward to hearing more about her views when she gets home." But there was a feeling inside the Bush White House, which did enjoy practicing a certain amount of identity politics. They prided themselves on how many minority people had been put into different positions, particularly with like major outreach to Hispanic communities. And so they were anxious to find a woman too, but either the women they found were too conservative for the Texas Bush.
Edith Jones?
Yes, and or they'd been suffering already from filibusters and other efforts by the Senate to keep Bush nominees from getting to be named to the appeals courts. So some people didn't have enough time or hadn't even made it to that court. So they end up picking Harriet Miers, which some people disparagingly said meant that Bush had picked the smartest lawyer within 8 feet of the Oval Office. But she was beloved by the Bush family. They knew they could trust her. They did have high regard for her intellect. And so she was thrown into this position that was really unfair for her because she's getting asked all sorts of questions about the Constitution from senators, and she's not a constitutional lawyer.
And the conservative movement, the conservative judicial movement, was not in favor of Harriet Miers because they didn't know who she was.
It was a complete rebellion. I mean, the amount of outrage from people who had worked very hard to move the court away from that rule of men, where people are kind of going with what they feel, into rule of law. They felt betrayed by Bush. They were very frustrated. He was also at a political weak point, and they felt that it had been a slap in their faces. They had worked very hard to get him elected and reelected, and to have in return not getting a giant. But it ended up working out okay, because usually when a president has to pull a judicial nomination like that, they have to pick someone more moderate. In this case, because the rebellion was from their right flank, they end up having to put someone in just based on quality who will meet the needs of this base of their party. And so that's how you get Alito.
The vote was 58-42. Both future presidents, Obama and Biden, voted against Samuel Alito. Here's a little bit from his confirmation hearing.
Can you tell us your view, just one more time, your view about the Constitution not protecting a right to an abortion, which you have talked about before, and you said you personally proudly held that view?
My understanding is you chastised Congress for giving so much power to them when the power should be in the president or in the executive.
Senator, I don't think I've ever said that.
When you listed CAP, was part of your rationale for listing an application, you thought that would appeal to the outfit you were applying to, the people looking at your resume?
Well, Senator, as I said, I don't have a recollection of having anything to do with CAP. So all I can say is that I put it down on the 85 form, and therefore I must have been a member.
Let me tell you, this guilt by association is going to drive good men and women away from wanting to sit where you're sitting. Judge Alito, I am sorry that you've had to go through this. I am sorry that your family has had to sit here and listen to this.
Mollie Hemingway, how did he handle the nomination process?
Well, it's just fun to watch some of this because that's partly what I was doing when I was researching the book, was rewatching old C-SPAN archives to see what it looked like. I also read the transcripts, but there's something about the intonation when you can watch what was happening there. But these were interesting confirmation hearings because they always knew that they would have enough votes to get Alito on, but maybe not without having to deal with a filibuster. And this had been right after the Chief Justice hearings, which had gone particularly well. But there's some interesting things in just those clips. First off, he had mentioned that he thought Roe v. Wade was bad law. And so some of the senators were pouncing on that. But from the perspective of the Bush White House, they'd kind of gotten a little frustrated that everyone had to claim that they'd never thought about it or never had an opinion about it. And getting someone confirmed who had been able to say publicly, well, I don't think that's good law, something that was not a radical view, by the way, they felt there was some victory in that. Or there's a mention there of the concerned alumni of Princeton. And I actually found Biden's question there to be pretty perceptive. He says, were you putting this on your resume to make it seem like you were more conservative so you could get hired by the Reagan Justice Department? I think there's some truth in that. He had not been political, but he was trying to get a political position. So how do you show that you're political? Maybe he had they could never find anything he'd actually done with concerned alumni of Princeton, which was a conservative group there. But being able to associate that way would make you seem like it was less of a risk of a civil servant, because he was a civil servant, he did not work for the Republican Party. Unlike so many of the people who become judges or justices, they do have ties to one party or another. They are involved in campaigns. You have Supreme Court justices who served on the Bush recount effort. They do that kind of thing. Well, that wasn't Sam Alito. So I thought that was an interesting question, but then also to see Martha Ann there leaving as she gets nice treatment from Senator Lindsey Graham.
Well, who is Martha Ann?
Well, when I first started doing this, I thought, how am I going to write about Martha Ann? You have never seen a more different group in marriage than Justice Alito and Martha Ann. He is so reserved. He is so humble. He's so quiet. He is unlike a lot of powerful people in D.C. where you can spot them across the room and there's this vortex forming around them. He likes to ask other people how they're doing. He's very deferential. If someone else starts talking, he stops. Not a typical D.C. figure. And Martha Ann is this, just vivacious, larger-than-life personality. And it's almost funny she's married to a Supreme Court justice because she's such her own woman. A lot of politicians have spouses who are very, quiet compared to their spouses. That's not the case. She's very smart, biting sense of humor. And then she became part of the news because the New York Times and other outlets, I think, went after her for her flag flying.
Yeah, we'll get to the flag flying in just a minute, but she was so expressive at these hearings, and then Saturday Night Live even did a parody of her.
Yes, I loved seeing the Saturday Night Live parody because she's sitting right behind him, and as you know, when the C-SPAN camera is on you, you can see the people directly behind the person testifying. And she actually shares this with her husband. He has also gotten in trouble for rolling his eyes when he thinks something didn't need to be said, or he famously at the 2010 State of the Union.
Well, let's watch it.
It's time to put strict limits on the contributions that lobbyists give to candidates for federal office. With all due deference to separation of powers, last week the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections.
Not true,
yeah.
He mouths.
I think he says simply not true. And even Linda Greenhouse, the liberal New York Times Supreme Court reporter, agreed. It was not true what President Obama had said. Now, it may seem quaint now in 2026 that this was a major scandal, but to have a Supreme Court justice sit there and mouth that was considered very inappropriate, and he probably did not realize the cameras were on him. He does have this issue, though. In high school, he was a champion debater, also in college, and he would sometimes get marked down for showing his feelings with his face. And he also is known for caring deeply about whether he wins something or loses something. So when he was young, he is and was a huge Philadelphia Phillies fan, and if they lost, he was inconsolable. And even now, his clerks say they can tell how conference went. That's where the 9 justices are meeting together, just the 9. When he comes back to his chambers, they can tell how it went based on his demeanor. And at the end of each term, the clerks put on this variety show. And one year, the clerks put on a World Series of Poker featuring Sam Alito. And the whole joke was that if he had a good hand, he would beam. And if he had a bad hand, he would be glum. And everybody would know what to do based on his facial expressions.
Well, before we leave Martha Ann, we caught up with her and Justice Alito in 2007 at the Clarence Thomas Book Party. And we had the chance to talk with both the Justice and Mrs. Alito just to give you a flavor of who they are. nearly all the justices showed up tonight. What does that say?
Well, contrary to the impression a lot of people might get from reading our opinions, we really get along very well personally, and I think it's a tribute to what everybody thinks about Clarence as a person.
What have you thought of the court so far in your first year or so?
I've enjoyed it incredibly. I mean, I pinch myself every day that I'm there, but it's an incredible honor and a challenge and extremely satisfying.
Any books in your future?
Probably not, no. Not immediately.
How have you enjoyed your husband being on the court so far?
Well, it's been quite an adventure. As you can well imagine, it's been almost 2 years coming up in January, and we've had so many opportunities to get to meet people, not only here in Washington, but around the country and the world. This summer we had the opportunity to travel, and Sam spoke in Italy at a large conference that we truly enjoyed. So it is very fortunate for me in that my children are both in college, and it was time for me to discover what the next level of my life would be.
That is Martha Ann Alito.
Yes, so you get a little taste of how different. I mean, they do definitely share a lot. They both like to read. They're both,
They've been married forever, haven't they?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly the year, but they've gone through a lot together. And she did notice the moment she met him that there was something different about him. She liked him right away. He jokes that it only 5 years later or something, 5 short years later, they got married.
Justice Alito said he's not sure there's a book in his future.
So I think that does speak to how he is different. That most of the justices have written their own books. They've certainly had other books written about them. And he will have his own book coming out in the fall. And he also has had so many excellent speeches, which I think will be a big part of that book that I loved going through to research my book, Alito. But it really is remarkable how you have people who have even been on the court for a very short period of time already have many books or books about them or both. And Justice Alito, this is really the first year, my book, and there's also another book out about him, and then he'll have his own book. So I guess it took 20 years to finally get the books going about Justice Alito.
How did Martha Ann become a subject for the media and for protest groups?
Well, this is another thing I get into in the book, is how the court is, unlike the other branches of government, it's really not political. So if you are the president or a member of Congress, you got there through a political operation that involved quite a few close associates who handle PR and communications and ground strategy. The justices don't have that. They each have 4 clerks. These are graduates of elite law schools who serve for 1 year, and then the next year they're replaced by 4 new clerks. You have a very small staff of basically 3 people who assist you with running your chambers, and that's it. There's nobody to handle communications or PR or political strategy. And as I get into in the book, this was kind of viewed as a vulnerability by some people who were frustrated with the more conservative turn the court had taken, and they viewed it as something that could be exploited. So you see political campaigns run against the justices, and much of that is run through the media. And they've tried that a lot, actually, with Justice Thomas and Justice Alito, and we've even seen it in recent years. But we've also seen them now start to go after their wives more and more. Justice Thomas has had to deal with that for a long time.
Ginny Thomas, well-known conservative activist.
Yes, and just it's gotten a little different now that so many prominent federal judges and justices have spouses who are also have careers of their own. But with Justice Alito, it really just got going here more recently, and with some campaigns against her. She does have a penchant for flag flying. She was a military brat, and she flew, for instance, an Appeal to Heaven flag, which is a Revolutionary era flag that was designed by someone for George Washington and was treated by the New York Times as if it were a secret insurrectionist symbol. And I go through a little bit about why that doesn't stand up under scrutiny, including that San Francisco flew this flag since the 50s or 60s. And San Francisco is not a hotbed of conservative insurrectionism. But it became a little bit of a joke as well, with people just making fun of how obsessed people were with her flags. And when Justice Alito was asked by certain senators demanded that he recuse from certain cases, and he responded, again, very dryly, my wife is fond of flying flags. I am not. And he said that, he'd asked her not to fly, certain flags, and she had declined. Later, she was caught on a hot mic from a person pretending to be conservative who was actually liberal. And the hot mic confirmed what he had said. She said, people think he can tell me what to do, and nobody tells me what to do. And so it kind of confirmed what he had said there as well.
She owns half the house. I don't control her.
Yes, yes.
The upside down flag. What's the background on that story?
So she was also in trouble because she has a flag outside her house, and she'd flown the flag upside down, which is a common symbol of distress. So sometimes people do. I live in a very liberal neighborhood, so each time Trump has won office, I've had certain neighbors fly the flag as a distress symbol. And she had done it in particular related to a neighborhood dispute. She had some neighbors who had been protesting at her house, had been joining those organized protests where liberal groups had posted the home addresses of these justices and then would organize protests there. And some of her neighbors had participated. They'd also had some signage of their own that she thought was inappropriate because it had
the F Trump
bad
sign.
words. And so it escalated to the point that she had done that, and again, Justice Alito asked her not to do it, and it became a major story years later as part of this campaign.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. Mollie Hemingway, you just mentioned that you live with liberal neighbors. Have politics caused any tension in your personal life?
Oh, sure. But, what are you going to do? So this is a liberal area of Washington, D.C., and it has seemed that in recent years, certain people have gotten less tolerant. I actually made a friend in my neighborhood because she had gotten kicked out of her neighborhood book group by believing in innocence until guilt was proven. And some of our neighbors had said she sounded like she would be better off being friends with me. So that's how I met her, and she's a good friend now. So these types of things can happen, but you can't deviate from what you think is right in terms of reporting honestly.
In your book, you write that the left has normalized attacks on conservatives in public.
Well, I am very worried about this. People of all persuasions are capable and have committed violence for political reasons. That is true. It is also true that it should not be treated as an okay situation. And you sometimes see late night comics or prominent journalists or pundits who seem to justify attacks from the left on the right for political disagreement. It is not good to have a country where people resort to violence. And it is, even the situation after the Dobbs decision was leaked, I think really speaks to this. The Dobbs decision was leaked in May before the final decision was ready to come out. And immediately there were attacks on churches and pro-life pregnancy centers. The addresses of each of the justices who had signed on to the Dobbs decision were publicized and protests were organized. People were rewarded for locating these people. And we even saw, the threats were much worse than people know or realized. Some justices had to wear bulletproof vests in front of their children, be moved to secure locations. And when that happened, there are laws on the books against threatening a federal judge for the purpose of determining the outcome. That was clearly what was happening because the decision had not been released yet. And yet the Justice Department didn't do anything. And the prominent voices, whether in the media or in the Biden administration, weren't calling for an end to these protests. In fact, they were calling for them to continue. This is not a good situation, and it's not how people should resolve political debate.
Well, the Dobbs decision was leaked April 29th, 2022, but in 2020, then Minority Leader Chuck Schumer went to the court, and he had this to say.
I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions.
What was going on then?
So there was a case before the court at that time that dealt with abortion. I believe it had something to do with whether people who are performing abortion should have admitting privileges at hospitals.
The Louisiana case.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
And Schumer, who I think was the minority leader at that time, did not want them to rule a certain way, and so he threatened them. Now, the good thing about this, I want to point out, is that basically everybody condemned him for this, left and right. You had a lot of outrage on the right, but you also had a lot of outrage on the left. Prominent legal voices like Lawrence Tribe and Neil Katyal and even some of his colleagues were saying this is very inappropriate to go to the steps of the Supreme Court and threaten in this way for a particular outcome. Now, Chuck Schumer himself has never apologized, even though he's been called on to do it for a very long period of time. You also had, a couple years later, a group of Democrat senators say that they wanted the court to consider a certain gun rights case moot rather than rule on it, and that if they didn't, they would pack the court. And that was also viewed very negatively by a lot of people, just an open threat. You've had Chief Justice John Roberts speak against, I think, both of those things, but certainly the Chuck Schumer antics.
What was the impact? What did you learn about Justice Alito's reaction to the leak of the Dobbs case in April of 2022?
Well, we might remember it because it was such a big news story, but when that happened, it was extremely debilitating to the court. There is such a sense of trust there, not just across chambers, but within chambers. And everyone really does get along, even like at that clerk level. They'll all go hang out and have drinks together. But when this happened, everyone knew that whoever had leaked it had probably been, a clerk or a permanent staff member. It's not a large group of people. Nobody knew who it was. It really broke down trust. I'd heard that the trust had also broken down after the 2000 election Bush v. Gore decision, that was a difficult moment for the court. But people just didn't know, what was going on. Among the justices themselves, I tell a pretty explosive story about how when that leak happened, there were threats on the lives of the justices immediately, and they were serious and severe. And Justice Alito asked his liberal colleagues who were writing the dissent, that would be Breyer, Kagan, and Sotomayor, and I think John Roberts was in there for part of that, if they could rush it because their lives were being severely disrupted. And remember, Roe had been passed or had been handed down 50 years prior. It's not like these were new arguments that people had to be challenged with for the first time. They'd known for more than a year that they were going to hear this Dobbs case. The oral arguments had been in December. Alito got his opinion out by fairly early February, but they still didn't have their dissent. And so he asked if they could ramp it up. And instead, they actually intentionally slow-walked it. And I tell some pretty explosive details about how that happened, including some fights in the chambers. And even when they did finally file their dissent in June, they included an unnecessary footnote to a decision that really was still being worked on, so that it delayed the release a few weeks more. And during that time was when Kavanaugh's attempted assassin was arrested outside his house.
Now, Mollie Hemingway, in your book, you put a couple names in there as potential suspects in the leak. One was a Breyer clerk, another was a Sotomayor clerk.
Yeah, so I talked with a lot of people about the leak investigation itself. And more than anything, nobody thought it was a good investigation. They thought it got started too late. They thought that the marshal's office didn't have a good command about who would have had access to that draft opinion, where they would have had access to that opinion. It's not just at the court, it's also in their homes. For many years now, you've been able to take work home and work on it on your laptop. Didn't seem to have a great understanding of the security protocols in place. So that was the number one thing I took away from it. It is also true that a lot of people do think they know who did it, but on the other hand, I don't think we'll actually know until or unless that person or those people decide to say it themselves. Now, there was some public speculation about a few clerks, and I certainly noted that, but I've also heard people say that they thought it might have been a staff member for different chambers.
For a conservative hoping to cement the decision.
No,
correct?
I didn't actually. I mean, there was certainly public speculation about that too. I never talked with anybody knowledgeable who who thought it was a conservative in any way. You might remember immediately when the leak happens, the left celebrates. They're like, whoever did this is a hero. You know, people are like, burn the court down, this is great. And the right is horrified. After a few days, when people started sensing that not everybody thought the leaker was a hero, then you said, well, maybe, you know, maybe it was the conservative chambers. There's really, I never encountered anyone who thought that a conservative leaked on their own to bring harm to the justices. And furthermore, there is, you know, you do, as an investigative reporter or otherwise, it's always good to think who benefits. And certainly the conservatives did not benefit from this in any way. But there was previously reported that there had been an attempt by Justice Breyer and Chief Justice Roberts to sway Kavanaugh. And I'm not saying that that means that either of them had any knowledge of this, but having more time and also being able to show how much political pressure there was, if people knew about that effort, they might have thought that would have helped that.
And you walk us through all of that in your book, Alito. What was the impact of the 1986 Judge Bork hearings on the conservative judicial movement?
I interview a lot of people, and I always find it interesting when you're interviewing anyone in the conservative legal community. They always have this origin story. So for a certain age of person, their origin story is being horrified by the Bork hearings. For another group, it's the Thomas hearings, and then for the younger crowd, it's the Kavanaugh hearings. So this is what radicalizes a lot of people to become part of the conservative legal movement. So Bork was this highly respected Yale law professor who had been one of the fathers of originalism, along with Scalia and a few others, and had been nominated and was properly understood as a major threat by Democrats in the Senate. And so he was way too open and honest about his feelings to get through Senate confirmation hearings, and they were nasty. I mean, it was the first time you'd seen them treated really like that much of a political campaign, and it was so horrible what happened that there's actually now a verb to Bork, which means to baselessly smear someone with allegations. So it was a big impact.
So what's been the impact of the conservative justice movement over the last 40, 50 years?
You know, in my view, the conservative legal movement has been very successful. It has worked very slowly to reform the courts, but also academia. I shouldn't say very successful. It's been successful. It's certainly been successful with the Supreme Court, finding and educating people who are able to lead in this way. The effort in academia has been much less successful, and I think there is a problem there. We saw recently that there was a simple, a debate or speech by a Federalist Society group at UCLA that was shut down through intolerance and protest. You don't have many conservative professors teaching, even though they're clearly out there and would be more than qualified to do so at many of the elite schools. You're seeing a lot of these elite schools embrace power over reasoning as a means of accomplishing legal ends. And so I think there's a lot of work to do there.
How did you come to hold the positions that you do?
Oh, well, it was interesting when I was writing this book on Alito. One of the things he says in his confirmation hearings is, I am who I am because of my parents. And I would say that I'm also very influenced by my parents. I had the benefit of having parents who we ate dinner together. We talked deep issues. My parents had slightly different political views. My father, when I was young, was more of a blue dog Democrat. My mom was a libertarian, and so they would have really interesting discussions, and it shaped me. And then my dad, being a pastor, also definitely shaped me. But I love learning, and I love learning from other people and keeping enough of an open mind to have your mind changed. And it's also why I loved doing this Alito book. I had always wanted to go to law school. I like writing things for a popular audience, but to be able to talk with high-level federal judges about arcane legal issues and then have them explain it to me well enough that I can then translate it to a popular audience was just a joy. I really had fun researching it and writing it.
Where'd you go to law school, and did you ever practice law?
I never went to law school. I would like to say I went to law school writing this book. I was, it was so fun to talk to people and they would mention some case, even something as simple as how the 14th Amendment, how the rights are applied to the states. I'd always heard about this, but I'd never really understood it until you have, a dean of a top-tier law school explain it to you, or a Supreme Court justice, or a federal judge. And so I honestly felt like I got to go to law school with elite tutors writing this. And I also think, I've always thought you don't actually understand something unless you can explain it to a 5-year-old. I learned that as a mother. And by that standard, these people who are explaining things to me, I being the 5-year-old, they definitely understand what they're talking about.
What's your association with Hillsdale?
Well, I am a visiting fellow at Hillsdale. I teach journalism, and I really enjoy the institution. I teach narrative and propaganda in American media, have really great students, and have enjoyed that a great deal.
Back to where we started. Is Justice Alito going to retire this year in 2026?
I don't believe he will retire. I think he has at least another year on the court. I could be surprised, and we'll find out together.
And what is his legacy at this point?
This is a justice who understands that you should balance principle and pragmatism. In this country, we have a lot of people who care about their views, or they care about winning at all costs. I think there's a lesson for all Americans in how these things should be balanced together, that you should have your principles, your views, and you should also think about how to effectively have them come to fruition. And that is something the conservative movement could definitely learn, but I think all Americans have something to learn from that.
Mollie Hemingway is the editor-in-chief of the Federalist. She's also the author of this book, Alito, the Justice Who Reshaped the Supreme Court and Restored the Constitution. And Mollie Hemingway has been our guest for the past hour. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And next week on the Q&A podcast, it's a look at America at 250 years old. But we also look back at our nation during previous celebrations, including our 50th, our 100th in 1876, and how we celebrated our 1976 bicentennial anniversary.